Hello everyone, I'm Larisa Grollemond. I'm Assistant Curator of Manuscripts here at the Getty Museum, and welcome to Painted Prophecy, the Hebrew Bible through Christian Eyes. Today we're going to do a little bit of a walkthrough, highlighting some of the major objects in the show, some of the major themes. So come on into the gallery with me. So we're coming into the gallery now. This is a show that is built largely from the Manuscripts permanent collection. So most of the things on view are actually from the permanent collection. I'll start with this object here, one of the kind of rock stars of the show. This is our Raw Shield Pentateuch, and this was really the impetus for the show. So in this exhibition, I'm kind of looking at the overlap of the scriptural tradition between the Hebrew Bible and what Christians know as the Old Testament. So looking at kind of the shared traditions, but differing interpretations of this same text. This is the Raw Shield Pentateuch, as I said. It's one of our only, is our only Hebrew object in the collection, recently acquired. It's open here to a section of the book of Genesis, which is really one of those very stable texts of both traditions. And you can see here that it's a very lavishly illuminated manuscript. It was created at the end of the 13th century for a Jewish person who was probably really involved with the study of the Hebrew Bible. So this has a lot of textual information that's not just the text of the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, but also commentary, and was really kind of a study object for this person. And you can see that it's a really high quality object, probably made in Northern Europe, again in the 13th century. So this was really the kind of impetus for the show. But most of our collection is a collection of Christian illuminated manuscripts from Western Europe. And so really kind of situating this object within a dialogue with other objects that were made around the same time. So to that end, we'll kind of move over to this object, which is what we call the Abbey Bible. And this object was created in Italy around Bologna, also kind of at the end of the 13th century, so roughly contemporaneous with the Raw Shield Pentateuch. And you can see here, also an extremely lavish, very high quality object. This is the beginning of the book of Genesis. You may recognize that word in principio, in the beginning. And so you can see here that this initial eye has these wonderful scenes of creation, God creating the universe, separating the heavens from the earth, creating man, all of these different scenes running down that initial eye. But you can see here that running horizontally in all of these little roundels are images from the life of Christ, so images from the New Testament. And this is really the key difference in interpretation of biblical texts when it comes to Christians and Jewish communities in the Middle Ages. Christians were interpreting the Hebrew Bible as the Old Testament, and so they really see every event in the Old Testament as foreshadowing events in the New Testament. So this idea of creation sets in motion a timeline that will inevitably end with the Last Judgment, with Christ returning to earth. Obviously, Jewish people do not subscribe to that belief, and so that's where some tensions arise. We start to get really differing interpretations of the Hebrew Bible, or what Christians know as the Old Testament, only in relation to the New Testament. So this starts to get at some really interesting ideas about what does the Old Testament mean in Christianity in the Middle Ages, what does it mean to individual Christians, and how do they reconcile it? So to that end, we'll kind of move over into this section of the show, which looks at how Christians are interpreting Hebrew scripture and the ways in which they do that in a visual way, the way that manuscript culture kind of explicates these particular interpretations. So if we look at this book, this is a Psalter, which is a collection of the 150 Psalms of the Hebrew Bible. Now, Psalters and Psalms become very important in the worship for medieval Christians and devotions for medieval Christians. This is one of those really interesting books where you can kind of start to see that differing interpretation. So we're looking at a capital letter S, and above you can see Christ making a blessing motion, and below him is King David in prayer to Christ. And King David is an Old Testament figure, as you might know. And here, by putting him in relation to Christ, this kind of above and below visual orientation really cements the idea of King David as a precursor to Christ. And this is something that was really central to the art and devotion of medieval Christians, this idea that the Old Testament and figures and events in the Old Testament were foreshadows and really prophecies for things that would happen in the New Testament. And so King David is seen as a precursor to Christ in the Christian tradition. This is obviously not true in the Jewish tradition, but really finds visual form in books like this Psalter. And this was created in the early 13th century, probably in France. And so you can start to see, again, a really lavish product and something that would be used by a medieval Christian in their daily devotions. All right, so we will, I think, head on over to the other side of the gallery to look at a little bit of how the Old Testament for Christians really becomes part of historical thinking. And so, as I said, in terms of devotional practice, the Old Testament is really seen as an important part of how Christians kind of make a relationship between the Old and New Testaments. But they also see the Old Testament as part of ancient history. And so we'll look at a few different manuscripts that really do that in interesting ways. So this manuscript, we call it the Belt Chronique. That's the World Chronicle. And what's interesting about this is that it really presents a whole bunch of different sources. So it uses biblical, classical, and other texts to create kind of an unbroken history of the world that was intended to reveal God's plan for Christian salvation over the course of time. And so the Old Testament is kind of set into the same timeline as events from ancient history, as other kinds of historical events. And here you see the Old Testament story of Moses being placed in the river by his mother in this really beautiful, really saturated color palette. This object was created in Germany in the early 15th century, so you can see already many centuries of differing kinds of interpretation of the Old Testament in these Christian texts. And you can see this really wonderful image that really brings the Old Testament as history to life for its Christian reader. And similarly, we'll just take a quick look at this book, because it's one of my favorites in the collection. This, again, is the ways in which Christians are really interpreting the Old Testament as history, as a historical source. This, again, is a text that is called the Mirror of History, and it brings together all of these different historical events into one continuous narrative. And this, we're looking at an image of the destruction of Jerusalem, and you can see the Neo-Babylonian ruler, Nebuchadnezzar, having captured Judah's king Zedekias, who's shown here wearing this crown. And the encyclopedic text here really recounts all of these biblical stories alongside historical events. And so you see kind of typology, as I was discussing before, with that foreshadowing. The fall of this holy city was interpreted of a fulfillment of a prophecy in the book of Deuteronomy, in which God warns against the wicked ways of the people of Judah, but they don't repent. And so the destruction of the city is seen as retribution from God. And similarly, a vengeful God is something you can see in a lot of these different historical sources. So we'll look at one detached leaf, which is a really wonderful image. So we're looking here at a detached leaf from another kind of ancient history text. This is ancient history until Caesar. And this is another episode that comes out of the Old Testament book of Genesis, in which the ancient Babylonians set out to build this great tower that would reach the heavens. And you can see here that it's kind of this text was created in the early 14th century. This manuscript was created in the early 14th century. And it gives us a little bit of a glimpse into 14th century building techniques, which are kind of fun. You can see these guys kind of hoisting up this building material with a little rope and pulley method coming all the way from these guys down who are cranking this stuff all the way up to the top of the tower. And so the moral of the story is that the arrogance of these builders, that they could set out to build a tower to reach the heavens, really angered God. So he curses them with a multitude of languages so they can no longer communicate with each other. And so this French chronicle, again, kind of incorporates this episode of Genesis into this larger story of ancient history. And so really setting all of these things within this really continuous historical narrative. And the Hebrew Bible also for Christians provided a lot of heroines and heroes, people that they looked up to and sort of saw as examples for conduct, particularly in the realm of women. And so we have a lot of female heroines from the Old Testament or from the Hebrew Bible, which are continuously represented in Christian texts, in biblical and other texts. So we'll take a quick look at a few of those. It's Women's History Month, so this is particularly appropriate. You may have seen this image on our Instagram feed recently. This is the heroine Esther, and she is the kind of central figure of the Jewish holiday of Purim, which was recently celebrated in March. And so the story of this person is that this king of Persia rejected his wife to marry this beautiful Jewish maiden Esther, and she appears here in this initial L. She finds out about a plot to destroy the Jewish people and convinces her husband to intervene on their behalf. And so she's really celebrated today in Jewish traditions as well as Christian traditions. Medieval Christians, especially the Dominican monastic orders, equated this queen with the Virgin Mary as Queen of Heaven and held her up as really a model for royal conduct. And so this is one of the ways in which figures from both traditions can be kind of interpreted in varying ways, but really important to both religious traditions. One major difference in terms of how women are thought about in each tradition is the figure of Eve. And so you probably know the very famous story of Adam and Eve from the Old Testament. This is, again, coming out of the book of Genesis. Adam and Eve are the first man and woman, and you can see them here. And of course, the fall of man, or sort of the original sin committed by Eve, is here really made obvious. So you can see her and Adam on either side of the tree of knowledge here. And the snake, which represents the devil who tempts Eve, you can see here has actually been rendered with the head of a woman. And this is an added detail that the artist kind of added in. This was kind of introduced in the Middle Ages, which associated the serpent devil with the medieval conception of female duplicity. So it gives the story kind of an additional misogynistic content, but really gives us an insight into how Christians of the period were regarding women, largely as untrustworthy, as synonymous with sin. And again, this figure the figure of Eve really becomes important to the art and faith of medieval Christians, much more so than the art and faith of medieval Jewish people. And so something that becomes also really important, again, is that relationship between the Old and New Testaments. And so what you have in relation to the figure of Eve is a creation of the figure of the Virgin Mary. And medieval Christians really believe that the Virgin Mary is a redemptive figure to Eve. So her action in bringing the Christ child into the world for the eventual salvation of humanity really redeems the original sin that Eve committed. And so the Virgin Mary is one of the figures that becomes prominent in medieval manuscript illumination. You can see her here at the Annunciation, in which the angel Gabriel arrives to tell her that she will miraculously bear the Christ child. And again, medieval Christians believe that Eve's actions were redeemed in the figure of the Virgin Mary because she was the mother of the Messiah. And so we'll end with, I think, one last section. And so you might have been wondering, kind of looking at all of these different objects, what was the relationship between medieval Jewish and Christian communities actually like on the ground? So we know that they have this shared scriptural tradition. We know that they have this kind of shared text that both traditions believe is very important, of course. But there's a real difference in the way that medieval Christian communities are treating medieval Jewish communities than is evident in some of the things that we've looked at so far. What's really obvious in a lot of manuscript illumination from the Middle Ages and Christian manuscript illumination is an anti-Semitism that does belie the kind of attitudes that medieval Christians had toward their Jewish neighbors. And that's often inconsistent. The way they think about figures from the Old Testament is not quite the same as the way that they're treating their Jewish neighbors. So for example, we'll look at this figure of Samson wrestling with the lion. And he's among the mightiest of Old Testament heroes, and he represents the ideal of physical prowess for medieval warriors. Here he is kind of opening the mouth of this lion who's very ferocious. And he's important in both Christian and Jewish traditions, but Christians see him as a kind of precursor to Christ, again, kind of like King David. He's one of these kind of complex Old Testament figures who's held up as kind of a model of strength and conduct, which has really interesting parallels with the way that medieval Christian communities are treating Jewish communities, as I said. And manuscript illumination gives us a lot of clues into these cultural realities. So we'll look quickly at one kind of difficult manuscript illumination that does kind of belie some of the anti-Semitic ideas that Christians had about their Jewish neighbors. So we'll look quickly at this really teeny tiny little image. Hopefully we can zoom in on that so you can see it a little better. This is an image from a Psalter that was also created around the late 13th century. And what we're looking at is a Jewish man in prayer to the Virgin Mary, holding the Christ child. And this book was made for a Christian reader. And this scene is kind of a miraculous recognition that the Jews would eventually come to recognize Christ as the true Messiah. This scene takes on a really sinister connotation considering the medieval practice of forced conversions and the eventual expulsion of the Jewish people from France in 1306, which is just a few years after this book was made. And so, again, manuscript illumination can tell us a lot of things about medieval culture. Here it gives us a little bit of a glimpse into the inequalities that were present between Jewish and Christian communities at the same time that both communities were using this kind of shared text in both of their religious practices. And so we looked at the Raw Shield Pentateuch at the very beginning of this broadcast, and what is kind of unseen in many of the objects on view, mainly because of survival rates, is the really vibrant Jewish intellectual community that is still very much present throughout the Middle Ages. And so we have examples of beautiful manuscript illumination being created by and for Jewish communities, as well as objects in early print. So we'll take a quick look at this object. This is a really interesting book. This is actually the first printed book that was produced in Lisbon, Portugal, by a Jewish printer who had been recently expelled from Spain at the end of the 15th century. And this is a commentary on the Torah text. And so again, this really vibrant intellectual tradition that's being carried on and even expanded into print. Some of the earliest printed books are Hebrew books. And you can see here this really beautiful metal cut frame that surrounds the title page. These are the kinds of products that Jewish thinkers, Jewish intellectuals are really interested in. And we can also take a quick look at this similar kind of printed book. This is a book that was produced in Italy, which is also a place that many Jewish printers ended up after being expelled from many different places throughout Europe. And this really becomes kind of a hub for Jewish culture and Jewish thinking and Jewish printing. And so this is the title page for a book that was actually a medieval text that was reprinted and distributed to the Jewish community there. And you can see the kind of little added little pen markings there, little marginalia. This is obviously a well-used and well-loved book, and really is interesting to have that kind of residue of different people who have used the book in the past. So I think that's going to be my time for today. Thanks for joining me on this walkthrough of Painted Prophecy. And for additional information on any of the objects in the show, you can visit us on the web at getty.edu. All of the gallery text is available on the web. And if you want to take a look at any of the other objects that we saw today, everything is available through getty.edu in high res and downloadable, so you can zoom in on all the beautiful details. And please let me know if you have any questions, and I'll try to answer them in the comments. And again, thank you so much for tuning in.